afternoon, everyone. Happy lunchtime. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Tatiana St. Germain with Great People Management, executive coach, your talent advisor, and assessment expert. Welcome to the webinar. I am joined today by my friend Tim Lesnick. He is HR thought leader and executive search partner. And Tim, welcome. Do you want to say a few words for those who do not know you?
Sure. This changes every time. So if you've heard the other two, you've got a little stimmy to it. But essentially, I've spent 25 years of my career, half my life, as a hiring consultant is the way I'd like to say it, or headhunter. Never worked internally as a recruiter. I've been fee for service my entire career, helping people hire talent, whether it's contract for a project, full-time, or executive search. And client list includes Google and Accenture. So I've played this game at the highest level and basically take this experience and expertise to small to medium-sized companies and try to help them hire better.
Thank you. And I think the conversation today really ties into what you do a lot, and it impacted my work and how my clients operate as well. We're going to talk about how to evaluate candidates for hybrid and remote work environments, as well as flexible work environments. There's different terminology out there. Before we launch into that, I just wanted to do a quick recap from the previous session. We talked about a few trends in hiring. We highlighted that it was a continued rise of remote and hybrid work. We talked about AI automation, and today's conversation is going to focus on some practical ideas, how leaders can better evaluate candidates for these types of roles, the remote and hybrid roles. But before we get to those practical things, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and talk about how we got here. It's interesting to look at the shift, the statistics, where we were before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, remote work was actually quite rare. In 2019, this is from U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they reported that only about 6.5% of workers in private business sector work primarily from home. So for most organizations, work was very much centered in the office. And I think anyone who had flexible work arrangements, like some of the salespeople, for example, in the pharma industry, they were kind of judged and frowned upon. Like, how dare they leave their home at 9 o'clock and come back at 3? And what does it mean, this nonsense about flexible work environment, and you get the work done? And then the pandemic happened, and what followed was essentially a massive global experiment in remote work. In early 2020, the number changed, the numbers of remote capable workers working remotely changed almost overnight. So Gallup reported that it was about 70% of employees whose jobs could be done remotely shifted to working fully from home. And for many organizations, as you guys all know, it was pretty abrupt. It was unplanned, and teams had to quickly figure out how to collaborate digitally. This is when I actually saw the faces of my clients for the first time, because now they did not have an excuse of not having a webcam. So technology had to improve overnight almost, and everybody somehow figured out how to use their webcam. So that we can improve that digital collaboration. How do we manage work remotely, maintain productivity without the office structure, a traditional office structure? And over time, organizations started settling into more sustainable ways of working remotely. And rather than going completely back to the office, although some had to, many companies adopted hybrid and flexible arrangements. Gallup here, as we show on the slide, reports that among employees whose jobs could be done remotely, 55% now work hybrid, 25% are fully remote, and 19% of work is fully on-site. So the pandemic triggered the shift, but the flexible work continues, and I believe it's here to stay. Tim, are you of the same opinion?
Yeah, I actually dressed accordingly for the first two. I had sports coats on and decided to represent a little, what is the remote hybrid look? How does that reflected, which we can bring up later. But yes, I do think it's here to stay. People make the joke with me, we don't know if we're going to see you in gym clothes or in a three-piece suit.
Yeah.
And I go, that just depends on whether I'm gonna be kind of hybrid that day and go to the gym and crack out some other things during that day, or if I have multiple meetings where a suit is required. And so um, a lot of things, variables also change along with this, which not to
Hmm.
be a forecaster here, but I agree that hybrid or some sort of balance in a great way has become the new norm.
Yeah, and expectations change. So to the point of attire, what's appropriate. I think there's a lot of flexibility too. Some people try to go back to pre-COVID expectations and mandate certain things, but most people, as we will see in the next couple of slides, what impacts hiring now and what candidates are looking for. They're looking for more flexibility and more understanding, and that represents some interesting challenges for the employers. So on this slide, I'm just really talking about how since 2023, where in-office roles declined from 83% to 66%, in 2024 and 25, the levels of hybrid and remote work have largely stabilized. I think there were a lot of frantic conversations and speculations anywhere between 2020 and 20, even as recent as last year. But I do have like this intuitive sense that we've settled in the flexible work arrangement. It's more or less a consistent and expected part of the modern workplace. And when workplace changes and how we do work changes, hiring has to change with it. So let's take a look on the next slide, what data shows us about hybrid or how hybrid and remote work influences hiring today. I can change to the next slide. There we go. I actually have two slides with very interesting statistics on talent attraction and recruitment, hiring outcomes. Comes from different the statistics come from different places, and this is where I can also get some of your input to what you're seeing as a recruiter and also talent advisor to your clients. 52% of TA leaders say return to office policies make hiring harder. 72% say remote roles are easier to fill, and that's from Korn Ferry. And some of the other statistics, as you're reading through this, 91% of companies say hybrid work is essential to their hiring strategy. Recruiters say flexible work attracts talent. As a recruiter, what is your take on
it? Yeah, 100%. I tell my clients, if the job is remote, you can pay on average 15 to 20% less. If it's going to be required on site, you're going to require a premium. The reason is it's supply and demand. It's simple economics. If your job is in Plantation, Florida, and you've got to come into the office every single day, then there's a finite group of people that will either move there, live there, be there, and can commit to the hours at hand. So depending on the skill set, you've just limited the entire talent pool to that geographic location. And so if the geographic location is now the entire United States, which a lot of companies actually, create little nuances, which I agree with heavily as well. We're not hiring from California or New York or Oregon, and I'll pick on all three of them any day of the week because they have insane hiring laws that just don't help employers do business. And yes, I want to support employees, and I'm not making a statement. I'm just saying that they can then make choices like Colorado. You have to post the pay if you post a job. And some companies don't want to post the pay because you might do a range. And I tell folks there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to the way in which you post and approach a job. And so in general, even the flexible schedule hybrid still does have its limitations, but in general, they're easier to fill because you have a larger pool of candidates. That's the first point. The second is people may prefer that level of work. Now, there's a whole other conundrum with productivity and how you
Right.
manage that, but that's another side of it. But I will say, of course, that's the case. This is, some simple economic formulas at work.
Mm-hmm. And that's the second promised slide, the candidate preferences too. That's the 83%, this first statistic really stood out to me. Candidates would turn down a job offer if it doesn't include some kind of flexibility. It's an interesting, it appears to be a norm now, even though early on it was judged as ridiculous. And surely that's temporary, right?
And adding to it is huge is this. Most hiring in general, people like to tap into whether they speak about it or not, but so I'm in this space for so long, is what I call the passive candidate market. It's someone that's gainfully employed and maybe looking for a better opportunity. And we often feel this is not always the case, but typically the best employees are already gainfully employed, right? And you want to get someone on their way up that may be limited because of leadership or whatever reason and may want the next step in their career and not be able to get it in their company. And that's someone that's been unemployed for 6 months and hasn't really figured out what their career path was, just as an anomaly contrary prediction, right? So I hate saying it, but more than half of the people that are unemployed for a reason. And usually it's something with their resume or their experience or choices they made, job hopping, whatever, pick your flavor. But my point here is when going after a passive market and when having these type of environments, a full on-site position or a not very flexible hybrid environment, just know that headhunters like me frequently get answers from all of those people. They're almost always responding saying, I am open to looking if this job is very flexible, hybrid, or it's 100% remote, and then I'd be open to make a change. So they're all actually more active than they are passive simply because of these three different buckets, if you will.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that supports the statistic from Gallup. 64% of fully remote workers will consider leaving if remote work ended. And people who are currently employed will seek a more flexible work arrangement. And actually last year when we did a webinar on hiring trends, one of the statistics that stood out to me was that 70% of qualified workers are passive, a passive candidate. That's globally, that was a global study. So that was kind of crazy to me. 70% of your talent pool is not looking for a job. So anyway, so looking at all of these statistics, and we didn't go through all of them, but we will send out a recording to those who attended and registered. What these statistics collectively reinforce is an important point, that flexible work has become a major factor in how organizations attract, compete for, and hire talent and select talent, and how candidates behave too. So that also represents, while it brings many benefits to candidates and employers, it also introduces some of the challenges for organizations. Tim, you alluded to one in terms of productivity, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I want to go through some of the big challenges I've seen since 2020. There were many studies out there. So one of the challenges, Forbes tells us 53% of remote workers say it's harder to feel connected to coworkers. And I do see this, I hear this, I've seen study upon study from brain scientists, neuroscientists to psychologists, and they talk about that connection and how difficult, or I should say challenging, it is for leaders with managing remote teams to maintain that team cohesion and team connection because in traditional work environments, connection happens naturally around water cooler, spontaneous collaboration, spontaneous conversation, informal conversation. Just by sheer virtue of being there in person, you end up talking about things that may or may not be related to work, and it's easy to grab somebody and ask a question. And that's how you feel connected. You're physically present. In remote and hybrid environments, those interactions don't happen easily. They can happen, but it just means that people need to be more intentional. So we have to do this communication thing and collaboration thing on purpose. It's driven from the top down because most people don't know how to do it. It doesn't feel natural for us to be looking at each other on the screen and feel connected. And this is where understanding how people naturally work and how they naturally interact with each other, how they're wired to interact with each other, is really important. This is the reason on the right side of the slide, I have a sample from the PXT Select, one of our flagship assessments, from the team reports. Our clients use this team report during onboarding because what they want to understand is if I put this team together, if me as a leader, I'm taking over this team, and I'm charged with ensuring that they're connected and productive and collaborative. How do I do that? Where do I get the language? Where do I get the insight into what makes this team work and not work? What are the synergies? How do people react to each other, to different stimuli that they encounter during a normal day? And these insights, beyond just the graph, there's also narrative in the rest of the report, really helps leaders become much more intentional about how they structure even communication and team interaction. Like, how often do we need to meet? Folks who are independent, if you have some autonomous individuals, they don't like meeting. So you have to make those meetings maybe shorter, maybe less. You meet less often, but you need to make them really meaningful. And those individuals who are on the left-hand side are more reliant, they're more collaborative. They want more meetings. So creating that sense of connectedness starts with understanding the people on your team. And then each team member also understanding where the other person comes from so that they know how to communicate with them. Do you have any comments? I'm just curious on this connectedness piece.
Yeah, I like that there is a formula and a piece that you have on the other side. If I may, I have a good story that goes to the other side of the two things I brought up and some of this. I have a friend whose son I've known since he was a kid. I think he's 24, 25, came to me about 18 months ago looking for potential for a new job, just talking about his career and what his situation was. And he was in a really good service desk role in IT. And he basically said he wanted some more money, wanted some more responsibility, and but wanted to be remote. He really liked working remote, which he already had. I'm like, you already have that, right? And I basically convinced him through the course of a conversation without making it long about what we talked about, that he needed to go back into the office, that I wasn't going to work with him, that there's no sense in me trying to shop to get him $5,000 or $10,000 raise and another remote job somewhere else. He's already got a great job. And if he really feels like he needs to be paid more, go get a raise. But I said, the problem is that at this point in your career, and age does have something to do with it too. You need to get back into the office and make sure this isn't the job in the company. Because from all I'm looking at, this is a great company and there's not really much objectives other than you think you need to be paid a little bit more. Fast forward, he did that. He's still there 18 months later. Now he's got 3 years there. He's been promoted twice.
Wow.
Right. And he's been promoted twice and he's now making significantly more money. He's very happy. He's like, I'm glad you made me do this. So the point is, too, behaviors change, but then the connectedness and then the rest of the teams, sort of, you've got to think of that ancillary benefit from other team members and that collaboration. That's not happening on a remote basis. No matter how much people think it is, it's not. I think it's suited for certain jobs in certain avenues when someone is a subject matter expert, has a number of career. But if you have any sort of career ambitions, or you have any sort of growth tie-in on yourself or on the company itself, being engaged and involved with the other workers in the office environment tends to be a much faster and easier formula, right? And so just something to take note of, that is also something you can use as a strategic advantage in hiring
Mhm.
when you have to be on site or remote. Don't forget, there are other benefits to that too, like I just mentioned.
Yeah, I've definitely observed that presence bias when it comes to promotions and building the sense of connectedness. And
And it may not just be just bias. Sometimes think of bias as a bad thing, right? I
right,
know you're using it in a general sense, like, hey, there's
right.
bias too. The reality of it is that they're actually right to do that because the ancillary skills, it's not just the skills. I say hire for the skills you cannot train. And I say when you hire for skills, then the person shows up, their personality, their attitude, their work ethic, all the rest. Those aren't skills technically. Those are traits. Well, a lot of what your stuff kind of helps find out which of those are weak or strong. And so that's the reality of it is yeah, the bias is just that, hey, you might make this thing, but you can't undo that, right? You sort of make that buying decision based on what you see. You're like, hey, I like the way John works. I like the way he
Mhm.
collaborates. He made it my job easier. He gave me advice. To your point, the old water cooler or standing around the cubicle, those things have ancillary benefits that otherwise get overlooked when you're pushing for why remote is so valuable. And when it has its advantages and disadvantages, let's be sure to say
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Our brains are not equipped to process virtual interaction in the same way that it's equipped to process in-person interaction. And also to your point about how it depends on the job, also depends on the person. Some people are well suited for remote work, others not so much. And one of the traits that we look at, and there's been studies to support this, is sociability. If you have reserved people, whether you have a reserved person or outgoing person, how does it impact their effectiveness in that remote and or hybrid work environment? This is one of the challenges we talk about in remote environment is isolation and loneliness. There's epidemic of loneliness study that was, I think it was put out in 2022. 90% of remote workers actually still report loneliness being the biggest challenge. To which, as a coach, I say, well, what are you going to do about it? Not everybody's equipped to actually take the steps, and not all organizations know what to do about it. Again, without that regular interaction that happens in a traditional office environment, they feel they start to feel not only disconnected from the team and the organization's mission, but it's just that deep personal loneliness. And when people become lonely and disconnected, they become disengaged and they're no longer productive. And it's both on the person and on the manager. Because where's the manager in all of this? And we'll talk about that on the next slide. I just want to highlight real quick. This is from a sample report again that our clients use when they select people into the positions, and also when they promote into different work arrangements. They look at this trait, and that's just one of the traits we'll look at. Reserved, introverted people are just better equipped. They're wired for more one-on-one work. They're not bothered by not being physically present with people. They're less motivated by interacting with people, which in itself can present some challenges because if they're also independent, they may not be as inclined to reconnect to the mothership, so to speak. And that can present a separate set of challenges. So we want to look at the entire occupational DNA of the individual to see which traits are going to be useful and which traits are not going to be and will actually represent a challenge in a remote environment. I have a quick story to share too on this point. This was years ago before we were even talking about remote and hybrid work. I had a client in Canada in a highly specialized environment. They were in the oil and gas industry. And in Canada is pretty isolated, but bigger parts of Canada are. So one of their this client's employees was a top performer for many years. She was with them for 9 years, so she carried a lot of very technical knowledge that would be difficult to find to replace her. And right when they were going to promote her again, she quit. She turned it, just woke up one morning and like snapped and said, "I can't do this anymore." So they called me sort of with hair on fire, and they go, "Well, can we see something from the assessment report? Where did we go wrong?" I said, "Well, did you use the assessment when you promoted her? Because you took her out of the work in-office environment where she was thriving. She was a top performer, and you promoted her," and I'm doing air quotations here, into this remote place where she worked in a trailer in the middle of nowhere. And she was so determined and driven to maintain her top performer status that she stayed in that job for longer than most people would. And she maintained that top performer level of work. But eventually everybody quits because we're like rubber bands. We can do many things. We can stretch and adapt to the demands of the position. But at some point, everybody has that breaking point, and that she reached that breaking point. So of course that was one of those moments. We should have looked at the assessment. We should have known that she was outgoing. She needed regular physical interaction with people, and they completely isolated her, and she could only last so long. There was good end to this story because the organization was able to actually build a position around her talents and what she offered, and she ended up staying with the company, and that's how the company was utilizing PXT assessment to job sculpt around the person's talents. So let's move to another challenge. Now, well, 60% of managers say difficult conversations are harder to have remotely. What do you think of that statistic, Tim?
Yeah. It is true because you don't know if there are distractions. You miss the human element. Look, it's out there from our first one. It's in the movie Hitch, right? 93% of communication is nonverbal.
Mhm.
And you don't get the same. It's better than just a phone call, these video calls and such. And I can be an animated speaker if I need to be. But, you know, it's not, unless you're like cued into subtle facial expressions. It's a great show out there called Lie to Me if you ever want to see that. I
I
watched it
love
through
that
to
show.
me
Yeah.
too. And I study it and I use it and I find out and I say, oh, that didn't land the way I wanted to. But that's not an easy thing to be. Is sometimes you could, miss confusion for anger, for frustration or anxiety and how it is. And it's just a total different ball game with we're creatures of energy, right? And people say a lot, you got to move towards what energizes you and away from what de-energizes you. And it's not about time, it's about managing your energy. And I'm just throwing little colloquial little anecdotes in there for us to think about. But I think it's massive. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I find that to be the case. I found phone calls where my words have been twisted. I've had myself in different depositions and HR conferences after the fact, trying to be a nice and helpful guy, giving valuable feedback when someone doesn't get a role, and then them taking it and meaning one thing, fragile ego, sensitivity, whatever it is. And so when you start with the warmth, with maybe even if it sounds corny, with sort of love and compassion and kindness at the front end, and saying, hey, look, I'm trying to help you. How do we do this together? That doesn't work. I mean, would you have a remote relationship with a husband or wife? Would you be married to someone that lived on the other side of the country that you never saw for 10 years? How's that a relationship? Right. And so the relationship has a wall between it, technology, and it's not the same. So it's not just difficult conversations, it's even the positive conversations. And so something is lost in translation, and we know that because of some of the things that innately make us human.
Yeah, and there was a fascinating study I read, probably again 3 or 4 years ago, it's a neuro study about how our brain reacts to Zoom faces versus in person.
Oh,
And
it's
it's not
fascinating.
just the body language, but there's certain parts of the brain that literally remain dormant and don't light up. It's like a dog that does not recognize its owner on the phone, on the screen, or they don't like register certain things. Their brain is just not processing a person on the screen. That's not a real person. And so there's something in our brains that prevents us. We keep fighting it because the conscious brain's saying, no, that's a real person on the other side. So we're forced. That's why I think many people can agree with me. You feel a little exhausted if you were on Zooms back to back the entire day versus if you were in person in meetings back to back the entire day. It's a different kind of exhaustion. And I
Yeah.
think it's because of that fight of the rational brain telling you that it's a real person on the other end, and and working overtime to read the language, to as I said earlier, being more intentional and over communicating on purpose. And I do coach in my coaching practice. I work with leaders all the time on this whole thing about how do we communicate, how do we have difficult conversations, how do you provide feedback and get feedback back. um, Coaching definitely helps. There's absolutely strategies to improve it and to cope with it and still achieve optimal results, uh, an
Yeah.
optimal output, get the best out of people. But also what helps is going back to the assessment results. You want to understand, like if it's you and me, and by the way, this is this I'm showing assertiveness scale, and I think it's a sample. Yeah, it's not you and me. It would have been fun to show you and me maybe next time. But this report is a manager employee report that shows the dynamic between two people, how the manager operates and how the employee operates. What are the tendencies and how do we work together when it comes to just assertiveness? We're just looking at that one scale and how it impacts difficult or not so difficult conversations, communication in general. Somebody who is more on the unassuming side of assertiveness, they're not going to take charge. They're less inclined to speak up. In fact, in their head, they keep telling themselves, oh, it's not that important. It's okay. We'll talk about it later. Um, and then as a result, the other person who is more assertive may own the conversation, control the conversation, and hijack the conversation and not be as open to feedback. So while everything that you, Tim, said about this being a real challenge and possibly insurmountable challenge, like we can never be as effective in remote environment on Zoom as we are in person, um, there are tools and strategies that people can implement to to be better, to turn this to their advantage. Because as where we started this conversation, remote and hybrid work is staying. Even though some companies kind of desperately trying to bring it back, let's all get back. Don't you see these neuro studies showing that our brains are freaking out, that we need to get back to in-office environment? It's just not practical. And it's not, I, I agree with all the statistics so far. The trends are, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, just I have to make two comments. One, that's
Yeah.
gold. I mean, I didn't even realize that about the exhaustion, and it's huge. And I find that when, and days like today, which is an office day, it was supposed to be a gym day also, but that got thwarted. And I'm already at 12:30, a little bit more drained than I normally am, and it's because I've been in back-to-back Zooms and calls all morning. And thank you for pinpointing that. I'm going to reflect on that. And the only other analogy I would give to folks, so in case you're not convinced of it, even though you said it and now I'm convinced of it as it's happening right before our eyes with me, is I've always felt trying to FaceTime with my 6-year-old and my 8-year-old leaves tremendous amount to be desired. I actually miss them more after the call. They're not really engaged. They don't really know how to talk. And I'm like, well, there's difference when you're older and you have more command of your command center, even though this
Right.
thing is so complicated. I don't know that we really have command over it. That's a story for another day. But little ones definitely don't. And I know, even though there's a book out there that says love languages and love languages work for kids, and they made one for kids, it's really more appropriate for teenagers. It's not for little kids. Because to me, I'm 100% convinced a child only cares about quality time, and they don't view dad FaceTiming
Yeah.
from the road as quality time. It does not tap into that center of the brain. So I'd love that study. That's a cool little aha, and that's worth the nugget and the expensive price for admission to this webinar. You know?
Yeah, so and we can go on talking about so many other challenges. One of, well, I don't want to go down rabbit hole. Maybe
Yeah,
we'll
I
come
took
back
us
to it
there.
if we,
Sorry. Yeah,
so
but it's
let's
all
get,
related, really. But go ahead. Yeah.
right. Let's get back to this idea. Okay, so we see that it's staying, for better or for worse. We know that there's challenges. How do we evaluate candidates? Bring it back to practical terms. It is the biggest difficulty in the hiring process. Many organizations agree. How do we evaluate candidates? How do we improve a statistical chance of hiring the right person in a non-traditional environment? So it's not an office environment. We need to answer some really elusive and very important questions. How will this person operate day to day? How do I, the boss, communicate with them, and how will they communicate with the rest of the team? How might what they bring to the table change the team dynamic? How do they stay motivated and productive even when they're working independently with minimal supervision? Are they even equipped to work with minimal supervision? And so these questions, I'm sure you would agree, they cannot be answered with resumes or what we see in resumes and typical interviews. We talked about the problems with resumes and interviews in our first webinar back in February, and that comes into play here too. So again, how do we effectively hire for remote and hybrid work? Because autonomy, communication, and self-management are very critical. And these are really difficult questions to ask in an interview question. And especially when somebody is transitioning, for example, from an entire career, maybe 10, 15 years of working in office, now they're transitioning to a flexible work environment. How do we ask those questions about the transition? Just because they were successful in doing something for someone else before, will this apply in this environment? So still, whether it's in my line of work, whether it's an in-office job or remote or hybrid work, these three principles still apply. You want to measure the job, measure the person, and grow and develop them and engage them from the start. So the first step is defining success for the role. Well, the first step is probably recognizing that hiring in remote environment is more complex. And then the next step is to make it more intentional. Because you and I could sit here and talk all day long about why it's important, why we talked about some of the challenges, and there are many more challenges in hiring remote workers. But some organizations don't believe it's a problem. So yeah, first step is to recognize that it is a challenge, and then paying special attention to how they hire. And then the first step is, what does success looks like for that job and in this culture, this remote, what is the level of autonomy that's going to be required? What communication expectations do we have, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that can be baked in to what we call a performance model, define the success parameters. Then we want to hire for job fit. Evaluate incoming candidates, fit them with the job, the manager, the team, the environment for optimal success. And then managing for success. That starts, people say that onboarding starts with the interview. You want to align expectations very early, often during the interview, and then conduct a very successful onboarding, communicate, collaborate, have very open communication, have the structure for feedback, accountability, etc. So all of that is on the managers. And this is where I spend a lot of time with leaders, coaching them as well as advising them on the bench strength, their talent pool, their teams. We do a lot of team workshops, and for managers to understand how they're wired to lead, the leadership DNA experience, knowing who you are, how you lead, and what your team expects you to do it's a game changer now, even more than before. And with younger generation, I'm actually surprised when I go to conferences and I talk to younger leaders and individual contributors, young people who are just starting or have a few years in the workplace. They love the idea of measuring what makes you tick and measuring what the job success looks like, and actually being purposeful about marrying the two pieces of data and providing common language to everyone involved to have a better outcome, to have a better conversation. So what I'm showing on this slide is PXT Select performance model. This is how we define the benchmark of success, the target of success. We look at 3 core areas: how someone thinks, how someone behaves, which is behavioral traits, and what motivates them. So instead of, and then it creates, the model essentially represents that target range of what a successful candidate needs to hit. We can be much more purposeful and data driven, and leaders feel empowered to conduct a better interview too. And rather than asking, do we like this candidate at the end of the interview or a bunch of interviews, we start asking, does this candidate align with what success in this role actually looks like? What is required to be successful? How we build performance models, we can actually use multiple data sources. The best ways to use your top performers. So we do job studies all the time. And maybe start with your key role, key position, maybe most critical, or the one where you hire the most. Let's look at your cream of the crop, top performers, best people, the ones that you would take with you if you were to start over. So who are your top people in this position? Let's assess them. The aggregate of their scores is going to create a top performer benchmark. This is as easy and as beautifully complex as it can be. It's a sophisticated process to be able to clone your top performers. This gives any manager, any recruiter, the power to hire A players all the time, every time, the first time. You don't have to do do-overs. We also have access to a library of models. We can do surveys. So there's multiple points of data that we can use to really pinpoint what success looks like. And then physically, as I showed in the previous slide, physically actually see what success looks like. And it can be tweaked because things change in jobs. And why it's important, again, it's because we know superior producers fit their jobs. They're actually more engaged and they perform, and the data shows it's anywhere from 2.5 times more productive to all the way 10x more productive. I guess it depends on the position, depends on the study. But fit with the job, fit with the team and manager. Are they comfortable with demands of the position? Do they have capacity to learn on the job? And do they enjoy what they do? Do they believe in the company mission? All of those elusive aspects of what makes a person productive it's typically, well, it is elusive, and it's not uncovered during the resume review or interview process. This is why this is such a cool tool to add to any hiring process, and it's especially key in hiring in remote and hybrid environments. What job fit looks like in practice. This view is just a graph where we took that performance model, the benchmark of success, with the ranges, that's the shaded area, and put individual scores over the top of the model. And it shows us where the gaps are. It educates me as an interviewer, where do I need to probe deeper? And I'm no longer guessing. I can have a very focused and productive, structured interview and learn about the person and where they might struggle. And I can quickly adapt my coaching approach, my onboarding approach, and even training. So the next thing is, how do we set that person up for success once they are in position? We touched on this, that everything in remote and hybrid work environment, it is difficult to have difficult conversations, but it all depends on the manager. So this kind of brings us full circle to leadership, to my coaching work, how to clarify expectations around communication and output. Success still depends heavily on how the person is managed. So you could take some of the stories that you shared. I would still bet that the outcomes could have been improved if there was a better structure, better communication. It can be done. There's some really creative ways to engage remote workers. It's just, it doesn't happen naturally. It has to be done on purpose because there are fewer informal check-ins, the visibility piece that can potentially lead to reduced chances of promotion. How do you create visibility? So to me, when I see these obstacles, they're like, okay, yes, this is an exciting challenge. How can I still increase my statistical chances of success, whether it's in hiring the right person or if I'm a remote worker and I want to ensure that my chances are equal or greater for promotion and building that connection? What do I need to do? And there's volumes written on what individual people can do when they're in remote positions to create visibility and create better connection and interactions, and also for leaders that are managing remote teams. So what I'm saying is, I guess I'm trying to make a case that it is doable. It's not natural, never going to be. Well, maybe it will become. It's going to be interesting. Like on Star Wars, if we develop a new technology like holographic technology, and then do studies, same neuro study with the brain to see how our brains would react to holograms of people versus kind of a flat non-3D image on Zoom. That's going to be interesting as technology evolves. But remote work is going to continue. So managers need to be more intentional. It starts with very clear expectations, and I cannot stress it enough, over communicate. You cannot do too much. Do not operate on assumptions. Anytime there's a little voice in your head and you're thinking, oh, did I make it clear? Or surely this person knows what they're doing. Oh, this is the worst. It's the worst assumption anyone can make. Well, even in person, frankly. Assuming that the other person knows what they need to be doing, or assuming the other person knows what you want. Do you know what you want? Half the time we don't know what we want, and we expect our teams to know what we want. So clarity of what you want and clarity of expectations, communication, continuous feedback, what needs to be done, how the work itself needs to be communicated, collaboration, all of that has to be intentional and purposeful. Team integration, without regular check-ins, we all know how time flies. Before you know it, well, look, we're already at the end of first quarter. And it seems like January 1st was just yesterday. How many times have you met with your teams, with your remote teams? How many times did you have meaningful conversation one-on-one with each one of your remote people? How many times did you bring your hybrid teams to get together physically in an office environment? Time flies, and without regular check-ins, it's easy for misalignment to build over time. And team integration, that's important too. Accountability for how we're going to communicate, putting your foot down and being very strong on this point, because again, in remote environments, this connection doesn't happen naturally. It has to be created. Actually, I was talking to my friend Melinda Stallings. We were catching up last week. She runs Disrupt HR in Austin, Texas. and they do like these, it's a big conference. She's amazing. She's a great keynote speaker, and she's going to be talking at the end of April at their Disrupt HR conference on the topic of remote work. So we were catching up on this, and she said something interesting that I think a lot of us are kind of intuitively perceive, but we don't say it because we want to make accommodations for people. She said that if you don't have your camera on, you're not showing up fully. That's interesting because like you can come up with a whole list of excuses why I don't have my camera, like I have my radio face on today or whatever, and it's especially probably true with women, or when there's a training session and there's 30 managers on the call and only 3 of them show the cameras. What does that tell you? It's fascinating. Any thoughts on this or any of the things that I've said so far, Tim?
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot. You've
A
unpacked a
couple
little.
thoughts, please.
Well, look, I had another story that came to mind on the remote work situation that my client had to manage during COVID, where he had his remote team on camera all day, every day. And you would not get off camera to show that they're working, that they're on there, because there's other tools out there, right, where people use mouse movers or use AI to make it look like they're working or set timers on things for when emails go across and activity is going on their computer to sort of manage their hybrid or remote work environment, because a lot of people have the suspicion that remote workers or hybrid workers aren't working. And so managing that productivity through one of the things you mentioned, which was a lot of communication. The reality of it is you can't be a passive manager of any kind. You cannot be a micromanager either in a lot of ways, because then you can alienate the other person. Ultimately, my client found that all day, every day camera thing did not work.
Mm-hmm.
It became hard, probably because of the exhaustion thing you mentioned, and pulled everybody back into the office. And now they're homogeneous and working great again. And harmonious is the word I was actually looking for. But it was a very difficult thing they had to do with COVID in mind, and tried to keep it going for a while, and it phased out and basically fell on its face. Having good matrix, whether you're using a management by objectives strategy or a results-based management strategy, that if they're in sales, it's activity driven. If it's operations, it's the accomplishment. And then truly giving people the freedom to do, knowing your process, how long things should take, what they expect them to accomplish in a period of time becomes critical. Whereas I think a lot of people are flying by the seat of their pants, and they're kind of just coming in and going through the motions and doing, this is just what my job is. And what's great about the exercise related to making a decision about this and how you're going to manage it, we're 5 years into it now. There are a lot of good strategies. And with AI taking on a more prevalent role in our workforce initiatives, a lot of these things that are process driven or repetitive related tasks that you have people doing, through this assessing your management and assessing what the policies and process should be, will only help you if you get this documented. Standard operating procedures, key performance indicators, how technology is used, what it looks like when we get a deal to how we get a deal closed, how does this company make money, and having the rest of your company, every employee aligned to that, even your warehouse manager. Sometimes people have this compartmentalization, and with hybrid or remote work, you can have an even further compartmentalization of your people and not aligned on that vision. There's models out there like US that help with this and such. And to me, I love the overall statement, which will be the purpose really of these 3 meetings. We've said it before, but to try to pull it together with some of the things you threw and what you do versus what I do, Tatiana, is that job performance is really the only way to indicate job performance in a vacuum. Past experience, I've said this on a prior call, is not proof of future results. Just because you've done something for 10 years somewhere else that looks exactly like the job you're going to do does not mean that I'm going to come in and be successful in the same way in your company. Things change, people change, environment change. Why is that important? Is because you need the right tools in your toolbox to make sure you're making the best decision. Trying to do that from a resume in an interview, or trying to manage saying we're just going to be remote and this is how we've always managed people, we're going to apply that to a remote model. No, it doesn't work. It's different. That information from these assessments and how people behave, how they work, how they fit in the job, what they do best. It's not just this person's an ENTP and this person's a high D. You don't even know what the heck to do with that. What does that mean with the rest of your culture? So the time has never been more important to figure out who your company is, who your people are, how your process work together. And these are very necessary, not like, maybe we should give them a test. These are very necessary tools if you are going to expect not only to win, I would argue exist 5 to 7 years from now.
Absolutely.
Getting hiring wrong over and over again and having 50% turnover, not knowing who's good at what they do in your company, saying we just do this because we just do this, and wonder why your competition is eating your lunch. We're in a time where there's going to be companies with 2 or 3 employees that are doing $1 billion in revenue. That's the next thing in our, and so how is a company doing $1 billion in revenue with 2 or 3 people? Well, you're like, I just want to get to 10 million with my little company. Well, your company might cease to exist if you don't adapt before those supercharged with AI and the right systems and processes, and then getting people that know how to use those and are accountable to their own strengths and the fit for what job they are on earth to do, if you will. Again, I feel like I'm on a soapbox. I'll get off of it. But I just don't want you to think that the stuff we're talking about here is another hiring coaching lesson. This stuff is imperative, and getting on it and doing it now is, well, I would say, do something.
Yeah.
Don't do nothing.
I think you're right. It's the precision with which we have to make decisions now about people, because there's so much that's riding on it. If you had 10 employees and you're doing $2 billion of revenue is one thing, but when you have 2 and one of them is not a good fit, think of the impact. So the precision is going to be so important, and you have to be more data driven. So this is why I bring up this tool as one of the very important pieces of information that my clients use, and they actually thrived through COVID because they had the right people. They knew how to communicate with them. They knew how people wanted to be communicated to them. And that's essentially, these tools and strategies can make you a superhero. You can attract people, retain, develop, create, and have a great workforce.